Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at NYU School of Global Public Health. My name is Sarah Taylor. I'm a proud NYU GPH alum. I received my Master's of Public Health here in 2024 with a concentration in community health science and practice. So before we hear from our lovely speakers today, I'd like to introduce the new Dean of NYU's School of Global Public Health, Melody Goodman. Dr. Goodman is a leading biostatistician and research methodologist and has been a member of the GPH faculty since 2017. Dr. Goodman's research efforts seek to develop a more rigorous understanding of the social risk factors contributing to urban health outcomes and how to improve health in high-risk populations. She has published more than 150 peer-reviewed journal articles with contributions spanning the areas of prevention, treatment, intervention, and policy, and authored 2 books on biostatistics and research methods. She is a fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine, a fellow of the American Statistical Association, and is the recipient of many awards and honors. So without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce the new Dean of NYU School of Global Public Health, Dr. Melody Goodman.
Thank you, Sarah, for that kind introduction, and welcome to New York University School of Global Public Health. I'm excited to hear that we have a mixed crowd that includes students, alumni, family, and friends. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of an introduction to our school. NYU School of Global Public Health is one of the youngest schools at NYU. In fact, this year we're celebrating our 10th anniversary. With all that said, we're building on almost a century of public health teaching and scholarship here at the university. The first public health course was taught in 1931. The first MPH degree was offered in 1987, and GPH was founded in 2015. In 2021, we moved into this building at 708 Broadway, and we have thanked the university immensely, and we're glad that you're here in our space with us today. So what does public health look like at GPH? We're guided by 4 principles. We think big, we go far, we learn together, and we inspire change. And what does that mean in practice? We've developed new AI systems that use satellite imagery to track urban green spaces. We've had student internships in India where they gain hands-on experience in global health and nutrition. We're conducting collaborative research with NYU Silver School of Social Work to identify effective policies to prevent suicide. And we have an overdose prevention team that works with veterans focused on life skills. Today's talk is another shining example of our research impact. Dr. David Abramson is a clinical professor in social behavioral sciences here at the School of Global Public Health and a leading researcher in disaster science. His work has focused on population health consequences, interactions of complex systems, and risk communication strategies associated with Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy, the Joplin tornado, the Deepwater Horizon, H1N1, and Zika, and on and on. I'm proud to say that he is joined by Katie Lynch, a 2020 graduate of our MPH program and a current doctoral candidate in social behavioral sciences. Her research interests include examining how local environment and sense of place influence community health, behavior, risk perception, particularly regarding cancer-related outcomes. I want to thank you all again for joining us today and celebrating our 10th anniversary. To those of you who are GPH alumni, welcome back. And to those of you who got a public health degree at NYU, but not at this school, we hope you find that GPH is your new home here at our public health community. And family and friends, thank you for learning more about public health here at NYU. We have many ways for undergraduates to participate in our school. While we don't offer a public health major, we offer a co-major where students can have another major and they also health simultaneously. And we have many 4+1 programs where students can obtain their master's degree within 5 years. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Abramson and Katie. You're in for a great treat.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Goodman. And it is great to see you all here. I hope you've all done your reading for the day. So you know, there are some spaces that are still available up here. So if you need to, you're welcome to come up. What I'd like to do before we get into sort of the interactive is provide a little bit of context. Let's see if we get this. A little bit of context for what we do and how we structure our work. So we're a part of the Center for Public Health Disaster Science. And that's a center whose mission is to do public health and social science, to apply that theory and method to disasters, whether they're natural, biological, man-made, doesn't really make a difference. We've done a lot of original research, primary data collection, and you're going to hear about some of it today. And you already heard from Dr. Goodman that we've been in the field doing work in a variety of extreme events since 2005 to the present, up to including the LA wildfires back in January. We also have a couple of networks that we've cultivated and that we use as platforms for reaching others. So one of them that we're a part of that we co-direct with 3 other people around the country is FEAR, the Public Health Extreme Events Research Network. Another one is the Global Coastline Initiative to look at how climate threats affect urban coastline communities. What I'd also like to do now is, this is the 20th anniversary of Katrina. And we wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what people experienced. So what you're about to hear is a little snippet of a project we did called the Life Story Project. And what we did was we took a mobile medical unit. This was down in the Gulf Coast. And this was the mobile medical unit that we were using, and you'll hear a little bit more about. And we retrofitted it as a recording studio, a mobile recording studio. And we were testing this question of, does testimony therapy or narrative therapy help people to deal with depression, anxiety, and other mental health distress that they were experiencing post-Katrina? And we had 50 cases and 50 controls. And for the 50 cases, we videotaped them. So we have 50 videotapes of these really evocative stories. And what we're going to do now is we're going to play you a little 3-minute clip so you can hear the voices and begin to hear what people were saying when we asked them to talk about what their life was like and what their experience was post-Katrina. And this is 2007, 2 years after the hurricane.
Because before Hurricane Katrina, everything was okay. I was okay. I was okay with the apartment we was living in, the space, you know. After Hurricane Katrina, it was like we had to start all over, and I hated that. It was hard.
Right now, I used to talk a lot, but I'm a whole lot quieter now. I don't say too much. And as far as my children go, I think they had gotten a little better, but their anger, they have a whole lot of anger towards, each other, to where I got to the point where y'all gonna have to, stop all that arguing, because if I'm not here, y'all have each other. And if y'all gonna bicker with each other like this all your life, y'all not gonna make it.
Sometimes I just feel like I just give up. I sit, like I said, I just sit in the trailer, and that wasn't like me when I was before the storm. I was outgoing person. Every time I looked around, I was gone. I was always trying to, how they say, get my hustle on legally. That's legally now. It is not illegal. But you understand that.
We never know what's going on from one day to the next, really, living in you're like, we're in a constant state of limbo, pretty much. You don't, and that messes with you psychologically, because it's like, man, what's going to go on tomorrow? Is the little FEMA man going to come by and give me that yellow paper? Or so you never know what's up, but at least we know y'all think about us a lot, and that makes us feel good, and we appreciate it.
I was just in shock that they had so many people at CAD, that riding around, old ladies that knitted blankets together and quilts. And, I never seen anybody do that before. And, because this place really wasn't like that before the hurricane. Everybody stuck to themselves and, didn't really mingle that much. But after the hurricane, everybody mingled, everybody had, and if somebody give them something and they got too much, they'd pass on down to the next person that needed something. You know, everybody was open hands. It was pretty good. It was a good feeling.
Now you hear people complaining about, you know, not getting this or not getting that. Instead of going, look at what people did.
So what was really striking when we listened back and analyzed all of these life stories that we heard was what people really talked about. And so when we think about looking at resilience and recovery, it's helpful to think about loss and growth, because that's really what people are talking about and how to think about resilience and recovery. And so the loss that people talked about, you would expect that they would talk about the things that they lost, the material things that they lost. And occasionally people did talk about that, but that's not really what they were talking about. They talked about relationships that they lost. They talked about losing pets. They talked about losing people in their lives. I mean, keep in mind, 1,800 people died. They talked about losing community, losing a sense of who they were, losing a sense of where they were. That's what they lost. So when you think about recovery, you have to think about how do you recover that? Not just how do you recover the car that you lost, the house that you lost. That's important. But what was critical for people to feel was, I want to feel like I'm part of something again, like I have people around me, like I've got those connections. On the flip side, there was growth. There were definitely some people who felt like this was transformative for them. They changed their lives. They changed their families' lives. And what you heard with some of these stories is that some people also recognized how much they depended upon others and how surprised they were when so many people came to help them. And it sort of reinvigorated them and made them realize, you know, there are many good things out in life as well. I mean, maybe there's a little bit about the Gulf Coast that's a little magical. For those of you who are from the Gulf Coast and you know the folks down there, they are incredibly open and friendly and welcoming, and I think that doesn't hurt. But you know, this is something that we've begun to see at many extreme events. So I just wanted to sort of provide that little bit of context and open that up, and then I'm going to turn it over to Katie for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Abramson, for sharing those really powerful narratives, really speaking to the importance of hearing from the lived experiences of folks directly in their own words. So I wanted to take it back to the beginning and ask you, you know, across this incredibly rich 20-year-long program of work, what really inspired you to get started? You know, why Katrina? Why disaster? Take us to that.
Okay. So in 2005, I was at another public health school not far from here at the northern end of this island. We don't really need to speak the name. And I had been there for a while. I had gotten my doctorate there, and I was working for the better part of a decade for an HIV longitudinal study. And it was a really engaging study and something that meant a lot to me and how I learned a lot. I sort of grew up in public health, let's say, on this HIV study. And in August 2005, when Katrina hit, and so many of us remember, I mean, not everybody here is old enough to remember, but I see enough people around who look like you are at least, if not peers of mine, younger, but you remember the images we saw on TV. And they were just so incredibly disturbing and troubling to imagine in America what was going on. And when I looked at this in that last week of August 2005, I was thinking, I need to do something. And in many ways, it reminded me of what I saw every day with the HIV cohort that we had, which was we were looking at a population, many of whom were voiceless. They didn't have enough of a political voice to be heard. And people were just now kind of getting a sense of them. And I was thinking, somehow we need to figure out a way to give these people a voice and to see and track what happens with them so that we can help guide policy and programming over time. So immediately within that first week, I drafted a plan to conduct a longitudinal study of the Katrina survivors. The problem was that I was a newly minted PhD and didn't really have the juice, so to speak, to like turn that into a study right away because it was going to be pretty expensive. So I started looking around for colleagues who wanted to join me, older colleagues who could, join and we could get it going. I found one who I'd worked with, a professor of nursing, and just serendipitously, he happened to be working with a group who had sort of combined, they were from the Children's Health Fund and from a unit at Columbia called the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. And the Children's Health Fund was sending down mobile medical units to the Gulf to help treat kids. So I made a pitch to the head of the Children's Health Fund and the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. It was the same person. And I said, this is what I want to do. This was now beginning of October. So it's about 5 weeks after the event. And he said, okay, we're in. And he essentially gave me $500,000 and a mobile medical unit to help do the study. So things were very chaotic in the Gulf Coast at that point. I started going down there on a regular basis. It was an amazing amount of devastation. The traffic lights didn't work. A lot of the systems didn't work. A lot of the people weren't back there. I started going down to meet with people that could partner with us so that I could not just be the outsider, but work with people who are down there. I went to Tulane, I went to LSU, I went to the Louisiana State Department of Health, I went to the New Orleans Department of Health, I went to Mississippi Department of Health, meeting with as many people as I could. Some people were, they're not interested in having folks from New York come down and, help them like this, but others were very welcoming. And so slowly we started building our partnerships down there. But what we needed to do the study was we needed a sampling frame. We needed a way to do a rigorous representative sample. And so I was searching for somebody that had the list because everybody had been displaced. I mean, there were 1.5 million people who had evacuated for Katrina from the Gulf Coast. 1.5 million. 400,000 of them were displaced for 4 months or more. And so I was desperate to find the list because without the list, I couldn't sample.
The list of who people were and where they lived.
Where they were, who they were and where they were. Were they at trailer parks? Were they in hotels? Where were they? And the state agencies and FEMA did not want to share that. And it was, getting to be this point where it's like, we need to get into the field. I had this team, a study team that had been doing the HIV longitudinal study. And I said, we're going to go down to the Gulf Coast and we're going to take our entire team once I get the list.
Right?
Some were graduate students and some were just permanent staff.
Yeah.
And so finally, in January, after going back and forth to the Gulf Coast multiple times, I had an analyst for one of the agencies surreptitiously give me the list, gave me the list of where all the trailer parks were, where all the hotels were, how many people were in each one. At that point, I booked our flights for 30 people down to the Gulf Coast. We put in our IRB and got it over the weekend.
IRB is the Ethics Approval Board.
Thank you. And they had never before done such a rapid turnaround, but they were, totally behind us. I did the actual sampling method on the plane as we're driving down, as we're flying down. And then we got into the field in January 2006, 5.5 months after the event itself. And we went from trailer park to trailer park, the ones that we had randomly picked, and to hotel. And it was at the same time that FEMA was beginning to empty the hotels and say, that's it, you're moving elsewhere. So we were desperate to stay literally 1 or 2 days ahead of FEMA. And there were times that people were exiting the hotel as our team was coming up. So we were trying to get folks into the study. Over a course of 9 days with our 30 people, we were in 3 big 12-passenger vans and a mobile medical unit, and we would just go rolling into a trailer park and disgorge the team, and then go out and try and get people recruited into the study. And we ended up in 9 days' time recruiting 650 of them. We then replicated it a few months later in Mississippi so that we had over 1,000 people in our representative cohort. And people were by and large very willing to talk to us. The response rate to us was, when we engaged them, 80%. 80%, when we knocked and talked to someone, agreed to participate. And it wasn't just once. We interviewed them over the years 5 times for 13 years to follow them and see how they were doing. And right at the end of that initial baseline, though, we were determined to try and turn the data around as quickly as we could. So at the time, we were collecting data by pen and paper. We didn't have tablets or anything like that.
It's 2006.
Exactly. But I brought with me a data manager into the field, which is an unusual thing to do. And she was intaking the forms as they were coming into the mobile medical unit and entering the data so that we could move as quickly as we could. We got back at the end of January 2006. We entered in the rest of the data. We cleaned the data. We wrote our first report. We focused on kids, and we talked about kids' mental health. And this is what was the first thing we got out of it. This was a front page story above the fold in the New York Times that said, this study is focused on how kids in Katrina are suffering. And it was paired with an editorial. So I just assumed, okay, this is the way the rest of my career is going to go. And that kind of takes us right to, that's the opening of the Gulf Coast Child and Family Health Study, the longitudinal cohort study, which essentially now spawned, the Sandy Child and Family Health Study, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill study that we did, and many others.
And something that, Professor Abramson may be too humble to mention is that it's one of the largest longitudinal or long-term disaster cohort studies that we have in the United States. I think the example that you just shared speaks to the importance of us as public health researchers and practitioners of being there, being engaged directly in communities, right? In addition to doing our really important analytical work here at GPH in the lab. Being able to be in the field so quickly, being that 1 to 2 days ahead of FEMA, allows you to engage folks and then actually follow what happens to them over time, right? So from the data that you have, you could see what was the time for families to get stable housing? How many months? How many years did that take? What were those housing transitions? What were the different factors that enabled some families to return sooner while others struggled and fluctuated? And so I wanted to ask you, thinking longitudinally, which is our big research methods word for long term, what were some of the trends that you saw with children specifically, their recovery and resilience in these 13 years following Katrina?
Yeah. And I should add, by the way, before I go into this, that Katie is really the next generation of disaster science. And so, what I'm describing is also a continuum that you're actually hearing. So from my work with the Gulf Coast Child and Family Health Study and creating this longitudinal data set, I ended up meeting a young woman who wanted to be a part of this. I'll get to your answer, by the way. Wanted to be a part of the Sandy Child and Family Health Study after Sandy happened. She was at the time a doctoral student at Rutgers. And that was Alexis Mergenoff, who has since become a tenured faculty member or a tenured track faculty member here after she got her PhD. So she ended up doing her dissertation in part on the Gulf Coast Child and Family Health Study. And then Katie comes along and she's working directly with Alexis and indirectly with me too. We're working together on any number of projects. And so there's already, you know, 2 new generations that happened. Thankfully, these generations happen very quick of next generation scholars. And hopefully you'll have a chance to hear some of the work. We'll talk about what Katie is doing as well. So in terms of some of the things that really stand out to me about kids' mental health, first, a lot of it was as the parents were describing it. And it was clearly, the first problem was education and how long it took parents to get the kids back into stable school systems. In a lot of cases, it took them a year or 2 years to get them stably back into school, which meant that they were going to be behind. And so there is a lot of problem that the parents were worried about getting the kids back into school. The parents were also worried very much about the safety of the schools. That didn't really change. And the parents' mental health was very much a factor at play. And one of the things that we heard from the parents and really from the kids is that the kids didn't want to burden the parents with what they were feeling because they saw how much the parents had on their plates to deal with. So a lot of times they didn't talk much to the parents about the issues that they were experiencing. And we saw this again in Sandy. And a lot of times these kids had anxiety, depression that lasted for a long time, 3 to 5 years, some of them after the events, in part because they really weren't talking to anybody about it. The way that hurricanes in particular happen to hit communities is a lot of times it's sort of like, we saw this in Sandy for sure. One house will be okay, the next house will be devastated and will be flooded out. And you may not even see it from the outside, but the inside is just a shell because water had risen and there was mold in the house and it had to be stripped down to the studs. And it would take them years to repair. And kids would be living in the midst of just complete chaos. So in a lot of these situations, the kids also often felt that they were alone. They didn't really see others they didn't necessarily see others that were in the same situation that they were. So that also affected them. So these are at least some of the things that we've seen. I don't know if any of your work has looked at kids as well that you might want to mention.
Yeah. So my dissertation research, which is, actively in process and ongoing, looks at wildfires in California and thinking about the parent-child differences and differing mental health, risk perception, and recovery needs, not only after a devastating wildfire, right? Like what we saw in LA in January, but what happens during recurring smoke events. So one of the things that I'm looking at is mental health outcomes during wildfire peak season, when you have recurring days of smoke. Like you might have saw as you were walking in, eating lunch, that picture of New York City with the orange sky, right? I'm not sure how many of you were in New York 2 summers ago when that happened. I was taking my PhD qualifying exams, so that was a great time for that. But we only had 2 or 3 days of it in New York, right? But there are communities in the Western United States where not only is that happening 1 or 2 days a year, it's happening multiple times a season. And now imagine if you're experiencing that, but you grew up needing to constantly evacuate from wildfires, right? Recalling the trauma of what happened, maybe to you and your family and your home, but maybe to your best friends, right? Maybe you really want to play soccer and it keeps getting interrupted. Maybe you were in high school during COVID and you're staying home because of COVID, but also because of smoke, and that's changing developmental trajectories and milestones socially that you're missing, right? And so how are young adults, adolescents experiencing this? This is an environment that they're growing up in. And how are the parents perceiving it, managing it, navigating it as they're facing their own life stage transitions, right? Of thinking towards retirement, thinking about their child graduating high school, becoming independent, maybe making decisions about, where to live. And so really thinking about families and dyads in the context of one another, in that, mental health, we're individuals, we're embedded in systems of family, and then also wider communities. So my dissertation takes a really multi-level structure to looking at the process of disaster recovery, but not as a disaster as a single moment in time, not a single wildfire, but a disaster that accumulates, right? Increasingly in the United States and globally, we're not just experiencing one large-scale extreme weather event in our lifetime, right? It's multiple. And so how do the mental health impacts compound and grow over time? There are competing hypotheses, right, on whether increased exposure in some way inoculates you, or, no pun intended, weathers you against the battering impacts of the next one. Others would argue no, that you are increasingly sensitized over time, and each event is an additional blow to your psyche and to your capacity to recover. And so we really look at these questions on what are the factors that enhance, community resilience, and what are those that don't?
So, one of the things that we ended up doing in thinking about the very things that Katie was just talking about is we created an intervention for high school students in the Gulf Coast called Shoreline. And the shore in Shoreline stood for skills, hope, opportunity, resilience through engagement. Because what we had seen in a lot of our work is that a lot of the problem among the kids, as Katie was really talking about, is number one, it's a sort of a community problem as well as a household level problem, is they need a sense of practical skills that build their own sense of self-efficacy. They need to have hope for the future, that it's not just going to be these events that keep on coming and triggering them again and again, which unfortunately in the Gulf Coast, they feel as though there's just a parade of them, one after the other. They needed opportunities to do these kinds of skill building and resilience building activities. And we thought they needed to do this through engagement with the community. And so what we did was we tried out at 5 different high schools throughout the Gulf Coast in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Those are the 3 states that we were in. We set up these Shoreline high schools where it was built around project-based learning. And the kids, usually about 20 of them, it would either be done as an intramural kind of club that they had, or it was just part and parcel of their school day. And it was very effective. We would bring them together at the beginning, and then at the end of the year as a collective, as a community, to talk about how they could build projects that would engage their communities to be more resilient and more prepared. And they would literally do these projects in their communities. They built hydroponic farms, they made preparedness kits. One group in New Orleans did, the high schoolers, which is where we were focusing, worked with 3rd graders in a sister school to do art therapy. And the reason they did that is because one of the high schoolers remembered when she experienced Katrina, that's what helped her, was the art therapy. And so this was, fabulous. It was working sort of on its own. Then Sandy hit. And what I did was I had the Gulf Coast high schools then mentor some New York City high schools to start their Shoreline chapters. And then we brought everybody together from the Gulf and New York, these kids together. And that proved to be a very sort of energizing moment, I would say. And it was a glimpse of ways that we could promote resilience in children.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think the example that you just shared really highlights something important and cross-cutting about all of our work, which is that the life stage is really important, not only for thinking about the timing at which you would experience the disaster, but your needs during recovery and then what could enhance your resilience over time. I think it's a little easier for us to envision that with children, right? There's a big difference, developmentally and socially in the needs between an elementary schooler versus a high schooler. But that also carries across our life course, right? So thinking on kind of the other end of our life trajectory, Dr. Mergenoff, I do a lot of work with her with older adults as well, right? And so in the US, we become AARP eligible at 50, we become Medicare eligible at 64. There's a big difference between a 54-year-old's life experience and needs than a 64-year-old, than a 75-year-old, than a 90-year-old, right? And so when we're thinking about life stage of seniors or being older, we have to narrow it down a little bit. And, so thinking of resiliency among older adults, I'm working on a really exciting new intervention study with her where she's, we're working with communities along the shoreline in New Jersey, in the greater New York City metro area, and along the Gulf Coast side in Florida to build out guidebooks to enhance emergency planning, disaster preparedness, and intergenerational household resilience building activities to support folks who are aging in place, in our communities that are becoming increasingly vulnerable to these extreme weather events.
Right. And I think we've both found in our research and in the stuff that I've done and what Alexis has done and what you've done, that sometimes surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, seniors are often among the most resilient. They've sort of weathered a lot in their lives, and so they're better able often to adapt than are the younger generations. They also often don't have the same kind of burdens that some of the other generations have. So, you look at the sandwich generation where those in their, let's say between 35 and 60, maybe dealing with both kids and with aging parents. And so they're going to feel much more of the pressures. Everybody's feeling the pressure on the economics of it. And, that becomes something as well in terms of, do they have enough economic assets and resources to adapt, survive, sustain themselves? So that sometimes plays into how resilient people can be. And, I'm wondering, Katie, whether we should talk a little bit about the recovery trajectories that we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, do we have a slide for that? Or
Yes, we have a slide for that. Funny you should say that. So one of the things that we've done is over time, we've asked people to what extent, how are they doing now? And I think, we have the full text of the question here, which is overall, would you say that your life is better than it was before Katrina, about the same, or worse? And so this is a subjective sense of recovery. And you could see that over time, things get better. So, we asked this over a 13 to 15 year time frame. And over time, things got better. And people said, now it's better than it was before. So we thought, well, that's great. That means on average, people are recovering. But as we thought about it, we thought, however, if you look at it by, the sociodemographic characteristics that we are so used to seeing disparities, we're surely going to see differences. If we look at it by gender, by race, ethnicity, by age, by whether you're a tenant or a homeowner, by whether you have kids in the household, surely we're going to see differences in how people express this subjective recovery.
Yeah.
And the answer is, we don't. We saw no differences, no differences in recovery trajectories by race, age, gender, having 18-year-old or under in the house. And this was actually pretty surprising to us because we were expecting to see those disparities and we did not. And so the first thought is, so it's like time heals all wounds and almost like that's it. Everybody is just going to get better. So instead, we tried a different statistical approach. We looked at latent growth curves, which is essentially taking the data and saying, show us how the data cluster together. We're not going to impose our categories on how it should look different. We're not going to say it has to look different by age, gender, race, et cetera. We want the data to show us, are there, let's say, groupings that are out there? And it turns out there were 4 different trajectories that we saw. These are the trajectories. Mm-hmm. And they were about evenly divided in the group. So, of the 800 or so that were remaining in the study when we did this, there are about 200 in each one. And I'm just going to put the names to each one. So we gave names to these, and the names that we gave to them were at the top were the resistant, those that had a little bit of a drop in functionality, but for the most part, they were feeling like they were okay the whole time. We've got the resilient that started out feeling like things were worse than before, but then came up to the place where pretty quickly they felt like things were at least as good as they were before, if not better. And then you had those that took a long time to recover, and you had those that were chronically dysfunctional. And these were, in our minds, subjective, right? This is what we ask people to reflect on. We did a separate set, which I'm not going to show you the data, but I'll just describe, a separate set that were objective, so that could we look objectively at how well people are doing. We looked at economic status, housing status, physical health, and mental health, those 4 items. And we wanted to see, are they back to where they were before Katrina? And we found different pictures emerging, meaning the people who say subjectively that they've recovered may not necessarily have recovered objectively. And the converse, the people who have recovered objectively, meaning their economics and housing is back to where it was, may not feel that they've recovered. And I sort of want to bring that back to what I started saying, where I said that so much of this is about loss and hope. And that fact that loss itself can be so overwhelming about how people connect to others and how they feel about themselves, it is inherently subjective. And so one way of thinking about recovery is that it is an inherently subjective process that we each go through in very different ways. So that's one of the things I'd say that we found.
Absolutely. Something that really stands out to me is, in addition to the data, is that you were able to engage this cohort of individuals across a 13-year time span, which is no easy feat. And so what are some of the things that for you and your team you worked on to kind of help keep this group engaged in this study over the long term? Because without that engagement, we wouldn't be able to learn these outcomes and trajectories.
Right. And we were able to keep 80% of all eligible members of the cohort for each successive wave, which is a pretty good number for a very transient population and a fairly poor population as well. So I would say there were 2 separate things that we did. Mm-hmm. We created a sense of, I don't want to say family, I think that's a little bit much, but a sense of community perhaps.
Yeah.
We would send them holiday cards every year. Of course, there was a secondary benefit to us, which is if it got bounced back to us with a new address, we would know where they moved to. But nonetheless, we kept in touch with them on a regular basis over time. Sometimes we would have these sort of side projects that we would invite them into, like the Life Stories Project and others. We were, giving them little incentives when they participated, which helped. We were paying attention to them, and that really made a difference. They really felt like somebody was listening to them and tracking how they were doing, and that was meaningful in and of itself. And then separately from that, we had a fabulous project team that got very good at tracking and tracing. I learned a lot about what bail bondsmen referred to as skip tracing, because we were using a lot of the same tools that bail bondsmen use to find people. And, sometimes it would be kind of, I'll tell you one story of how we found somebody. We're having a very hard time finding this person. And one of our tracers was looking at this person's social media and noticed that they had a picture and they were wearing a uniform from an auto body shop. So they expanded it to look where the name of the auto body shop. They Googled it. They called the auto body shop and asked for Mike, and Mike was there. And it's like, that's how we got back in touch with Mike.
And I think that's a good lesson for any of the students in the room who in class might be, working with a data set, right? And, doing a survey study and being like, oh, well, like I'm working with this professor, they have this data, I could ask different research questions of it. And then really understanding, where does that data come from, right? Each data point is a person, right? In public health numbers, it's people, and each data point you have involved so much work, not only on your time, but on that participant's time. And I think you all have done a great job of really honoring the stories of these individuals, as well as understanding how in the aggregate, it could tell us something scientifically about the science of resilience.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, Katie, if I can show one more slide.
Absolutely.
And then we could open it up for questions.
Yeah.
So the last slide that I want to show is what we've come to think of when we think of resilience as the resilience activation framework. And this is a way of thinking about how do you promote resilience. And it's built on some psychological theories known as the one in particular known as conservation of resource theory. And the idea is that people have a need to hold on to at least 4 very specific capitals in their life. They need to hold on to economic capital, human capital, social capital, and political capital. Those are very important resources for people that they need to have to buffer the stresses of both everyday life and of extreme events. And those same capitals can play out at individual and at community levels. So you can think about them in sort of multiple ways at multiple levels. But to the extent that people can maintain these, acquire them, exchange for them, these are the kinds of things that will let people manage the sort of getting buffeted by the extreme events, whatever the extreme event is. And you could just substitute, COVID, H1N1, wildfires, 9/11, any one of these. They all leave people feeling the need for all of these capitals.
Well, I'd like to ask you guys to give a big round of applause to our experts today, Katie Lynch and Dr. David Abramson.